requirement regulation, and I know that for Michael, you know, he must be thinking, wow, I'm walking into the lion's den here, because it's not always a popular subject, but with the small scale or community scale biofuels producers, but it's something that's very important because it obviously affects us all. And when we're looking at growth and spreading, you know, this great product that we're making around, I mean, it's something that we always butt our heads up against, so it's very important. And the other way around, I think that in some ways we're looking at Michael and thinking, wow, this is the you know, the lion coming into the you know, into the flock, and it's, so I want to dispel that kind of, you know, potential animosity here. And I'd say personally that I've known Michael for quite a few years, since he did come to the Duncan Farmers Market while we were selling biodiesel by the jug. And we had a great coffee and we talked. He gave us some pamphlets, and we've had a dialogue ever since. And that's been a very important thing, I think, from both of our perspectives. And so, again, I like to say Michael's perspective is very welcome here, and I think it's very valuable. So without any further delay, Michael Rensing from the Ministry of Energy and Mines.
Well, I appreciate the chance to talk to you today. I was saying to Brian a little earlier that I've spent several years now talking to an audience of oil company folks. And let me tell you, that's an experience. This is the other end of the spectrum, and I'm finding it very encouraging to see that there are people who are still very passionate about renewable fuel, 100-mile diet for the car, local production, because I think that we wouldn't have a renewable fuel requirement in this province if it wasn't for the people who are passionate about it in the beginning, setting the example and creating some acceptance and social license for this. And I have a slide or two on that a little bit later. So the reason we have a number of regulations in BC is related to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. Like him or not, Gordon Campbell was very serious about reducing GHG emissions in this province, and it was his government that brought in a whole suite of greenhouse gas reduction acts. Like, they lead to really unwieldy acronyms, and so we have the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Brackets Acts. Starts with the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Targets Act that applies to provincial government, municipal governments, requiring reductions in carbon emissions in the next few years. There's the Greenhouse Gas Reduction, Renewable and Low Carbon Fuel Requirements Act, which is the act and the regulation that I've been dealing with for the last few years. So our acronym is the RLCFRR. We don't pronounce it. There's a Greenhouse Gas Reduction Emission Standards Statutes Amendment Act. That's an act that amended other acts, and it did things like allow for changes in forest tenure licensing so that biofuel companies could potentially access woody biomass, beetle kill wood, and so on. A really easy first step. We're now discovering just how difficult it is to get access to that timber, not because of problems with companies, but because this is a big mountainous province, and it's pretty hard to get enough biomass to feed a respectable size energy production facility within an economical radius of your operation. There were a number of other, excuse me for a second, I know I'm stepping out of camera range. A number of other measures in there, forest tenure, allowing for picking up wood waste on the side of the road. And I don't just mean lumber picking. If you go into logging country, you'll find truckloads of lumber stacked on the side of the road. And if you go back a few years later, you'll still find those same piles sometimes. They just weren't economical to turn into timbers. And why didn't we convert them into energy if they had no other value? Why leave them there? I remember a proposal that didn't work out too well for Port Hardy, clearing all the alder that grows on the side of the road and turning it into community energy. The assessment was that there's enough harvested just to keep the highways safe every year to provide enough energy to keep the community warm. So that was enabled under that act. There's the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Cap and Trade Act. I won't go into that too much. We're still moving forward slowly on that, but it's the type of legislation that requires cooperation outside of the British Columbia jurisdiction, and so it takes a long time to herd all the cats in the same direction. There's the Carbon Tax Act, the idea that if we tax the emissions, that there will be an incentive to reduce the emissions. And Greenhouse Gas Reduction Vehicle Emissions Standards Act. And the good news is that that one may not be going forward. The idea was that British Columbia would put in regulations to require effectively efficiency improvements in vehicles, which would lead to the reduction then of emissions from the tailpipe. And the reason we don't need to go forward is that the American government and the Canadian government usually go together on standards, and they are moving beyond what British Columbia was originally going to attempt. The difficulty for BC alone is, of course, that we're not really that large enough to affect the automobile industry. North America is, there's no question. I think last week, Obama's government announced that the 2017 emissions or fuel efficiency target will be 65 miles per gallon for the fleet.
56.
56?
I think it's 55, 65, 55.
I may be quoting a translated into Canadian gallons number, which would be 5/4. So
Oh, yeah.
it's an astonishing number, really it is, when you look at trucks still selling at 18 miles per gallon. This curve is one that I found in a colleague's slide deck. He's an economist. The idea being that we have to achieve some form of market transformation. And the small scale operations work in a way down here in the beginning of the curve. The early adopters, the enthusiasts, you're building some understanding, you're solving problems, but you're not also, unfortunately, making a huge penetration in that very large market. And often what's needed then is when there is enough understanding, capacity, you bring in incentives. We had a motor fuel tax exemption for renewable fuels for several years. That did achieve some success. And then the next step is to require, with regulated standards, certain usage of the product, in this case volume requirements, as well as the low carbon requirements. So a little bit of the political history of the timeline on this. In 2007, there's a BC Energy Plan was announced. You can still find it online because it is our current energy plan. That included the mandate to require renewable fuels and to implement a 10% reduction in carbon intensity of fuels. At the same time, we signed the MOU with California, so we've got lots of photos of Gordon Campbell and Arnie together, arms wrapped around each other. 2008, we brought the act into the legislature and it was passed. And so we went back to work and created the regulation, so that in the spring the act came into force, gave us the powers to create the regulation, which came into, which was passed by cabinet in 2008. The requirements started in 2010, with the ability to account for fuels delivered in 2009, renewable content, to count towards your activity. So it was supposed to create a bit of a soft start, that anything you can do in 2009, count the renewable towards 2010, and that'll help you get started. And then January 1st, 2010, the regulation came into force, and I will get to what those regs are. The regulation applies to fuel producers and importers. So Chevron and Husky have refineries in British Columbia. They're subject to the regulation. Co-op, Imperial, G&B, ethanol, all import fuel, they're subject to the regulation. SuperSave buys all their fuel in British Columbia. They're not subject to the regulation. We're customers, we're not subject to the regulation. That fuel has already been touched by the importer or producer who's responsible for it. So it's a regulation that's meant to be up as high as possible to reach those who have the resources, presumably, to comply with the requirements and to reach as far as possible into the province. 6 suppliers supply 93% of the fuel in this province. We added flexibility, and one of the mechanisms is that if somebody were to want to participate in compliance, deliver renewable fuels, they can take on the responsibility. They can become the party that complies, and the mechanism is to allow that to happen in writing, so we have a record of who's responsible. It also means that if you're one of the small suppliers and you don't want the hassles, the big guys can't just automatically force it on you. You have to agree. So the idea being that the consumers, or again, in the United States it gets to be called the jobbers, and the individuals are not directly impacted by the regulation, don't have to take action, you just reap the benefit. What fuels? Gasoline and diesel fuel when used for transportation. Now, transportation is a really broad category. It might not be intuitive to you, but lawnmowers constitute transportation because they use transportation fuel. It's an inventory sense of transportation. So when the national GHG inventory system takes a look at where do the emissions occur from the use of gasoline or diesel, you end up with pipelines and railways and off-road equipment. Off-road not meaning 4x4s, meaning construction equipment, anything that does not operate on-road but uses the same fuel. It covers generators, it covers all kinds of things. There are sort of a few exceptions to them. One of them is military use. And by that we crafted a definition that means that the armed forces are not necessarily military use when they run a truck around town. It's military use when they're out saving lives or fighting a war somewhere. And we didn't feel like getting into the debate as to how appropriate this new fuels might be when lives are at stake. The other is that there are, as everybody knows, there are some technical issues with water and biodiesel, water and ethanol. A number of our destroyers operate with fuel tanks that as they empty are filled with water to maintain the ballast level, and then the fuel is separated by centrifuge as it arrives at the engine. I can pretty much guarantee that biodiesel is going to fail. Just the affinity with water and the properties of it. But again, they may be able to solve the problems, but not with the fleet as it exists today. The other part is they have to meet international treaty obligations. Same kind of thing with aviation. Diesel is not an aviation fuel, but gasoline is for recreational purposes. If you take your Cessna up in the air and the ethanol has accumulated a little too much water and your fuel freezes, it's kind of hard to restart the engine before something disastrous happens. So they're exempt too. And then just the practical thing that if you fuel up outside the province and you drive into the province, that fuel doesn't count because it's trivial amounts and you know, it's sort of a standard thing in any fuel regulation that you're not required to deal with what's in your vehicle. It's what you are supplied with inside the province that is regulated. And a summary of the other standards that are in Canada right now. BC this year is requiring 5% renewable content, and I'm going to keep saying renewable content because we don't specify that it has to be ethanol. It could be biobutanol, it could be renewable methanol according to somebody's plan, but it's supposed to be renewable. Same thing on the diesel side. We actually have 2 kinds of renewable diesel in this province. The requirement is 4% this year, it was 3% last year, and it will be 5% next year. We forced the oil companies into a pretty fast transition. They didn't know much about biodiesel in the beginning and have been on a very steep learning curve, and we had to acknowledge that in giving them a little bit more time to come to grips with the fuel. So a transition into slowly increasing levels seemed the right way to go.
What is the current percentage?
4% for this year.
Are they actually meeting that target?
We check once a year when they report, so I can tell you that they met the 3% target,
Okay.
and we expect them to meet the 4% target. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Alberta has brought in their 5% ethanol, 2% biodiesel requirement, and added a little twist to that the fuel must have a 25% carbon intensity reduction over the petroleum equivalent before it's allowed in. So don't try and import your coal-fired, wasteful fertilized, dry distiller grain corn ethanol because it won't pass their threshold. So there's some protection built in that way. Saskatchewan has had a 7.5% ethanol requirement for quite a while, and they're bringing in a 2% biodiesel requirement next July. Manitoba is 8.5% gasoline and 2% diesel. They crow that they brought their regulation in 1 month ahead of us. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a rivalry between the bureaucrats to get the reg out first. Ontario is 5% ethanol, no biodiesel requirement. And then on top of all of that, we have a federal 5% renewable in gasoline, 2% renewable in diesel that has to be achieved. And one of the reasons why we still have provincial requirements is that you can meet that federal requirement by selling fuel only in Quebec and Ontario. So if you want to see local benefits from the use of the fuels, you still have to have some local regulations in place. The other piece of the legislation, the low carbon fuels that we have in British Columbia, is that there's a requirement that there's a 10% reduction for all fuels sold in British Columbia of the carbon intensity of the fuel. So we have, we're using the National GH Genius program, which is a life cycle assessment modeling tool that is similar to GREET in the United States, but with Canadian data. And all fuels are assessed according to their carbon intensity, their full life cycle well-to-wheels emissions. And for each company to comply with the regulation, they have to bring their company average for all the fuels they sell in a year down 10% by 2020. And so the estimate right now is that with today's biofuels, they can achieve about 6% reductions. If we go to 10% ethanol, 10% renewable diesels, to get the last 4%, we're going to need electric vehicles, some natural gas vehicles. We're going to need better biofuels. We'd like to see them do some work with the refineries. Let's hope things like carbon capture and storage pays off so that they can clean up the oil sands operations. All of these things should be able to generate compliance under our regulation. And this is the mechanism that BC has to incent moves to alternative fuels beyond gasoline and diesel. So this is where some benefit comes in from selling electricity for electric vehicles or natural gas for the natural gas vehicles. The rest is left to industry to figure out how to get it into the market, and we're working on some behind the scenes policy and so on as well. Do you want to ask a quick question?
Yeah, so how would you keep track of the electric vehicle pathway? You're not doing that yet, are you?
Not doing it yet, but 1% of the carbon intensity reductions in this province, very roughly, is already in place with electric vehicles.
So the electric truck buses in Vancouver?
The electric buses, the trolleys in Vancouver, and SkyTrain.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have to look at the policy there of giving BC Hydro something for nothing in terms of credit there, but we want to make sure that there's still an incentive to move farther with that. And in fact, I know that TransLink has worked out under the carbon neutral regulations. They've worked out protocols to generate carbon credit for buying more electric trolleys and expanding that system. And then the next step is smart meters. Because smart meters can be easily linked to your electric vehicle being plugged in to charge. And BC Hydro then can generate credit or information that we are moving towards more electricity use for transportation. Yeah.
But somehow it doesn't seem to be, I don't know whether to choose, but anyway, if you use an existing system like the SkyTrain in Vancouver, and say you introduce something new, you introduce a new requirement and say, okay, we're going to count that in, then there's less incentive for developing really something new that didn't exist at that point, you know?
Yes.
And then the second question would be, how does it transfer to communities like, say, Victoria, that do not have an electric system per se? So is there some incentive there too?
Mhm.
Because the incentive needs to be to develop something new, not say, okay, we fill it around so that the existing fits under the requirement.
Yes. This is the first, along with California, this is the first regulation of its kind in the world. BC is leading on this. And California didn't get it right, and neither did we. We've just had Parliamentary Secretary John Yap conduct a series of consultation meetings in July, and the report is being finalized. Issues like that we're recognized, and there will be a series of recommendations to the minister that will include things like that, that we need to have a regulation that starts where we are today and incents and recognizes changes, not the status quo. Okay, so we have some issues with this, the fine details and the structure of the regulation, where oil companies can show that they've reduced carbon intensity when all they've done is take advantage of some poor descriptions of mathematics in the regulation, and nothing really has changed. So we're correcting that. The situation of giving carbon credit for something that's already in place has to be addressed.
Yeah. In particular, like a BC Hydro, there's a consumer that does something for environmentally, let's say by purchasing an electric car, and then BC Hydro, the electricity company, takes credit for that?
But only for the sale of the electricity. There are other programs that are under consideration. I can't say too much because I have to think about what do I know that is not out in public yet. There are programs for electric vehicle incentives, and we have at least one person in the ministry who has been heavily involved for the past 4 or 5 years with hydrogen vehicles, electric vehicles. That's the reason why we are getting the MEAV and the LEAF, and the Chevy Volt is coming to the island next month, apparently, for sale up in Nanaimo, because BC is seen as a leader in creating some incentives. I guess one of the difficulties is that if we pause and say congratulations to ourselves, we will be passed by everybody else in the very near future. So these are all very dynamic policy areas, and we have to make sure that we keep pushing on this front and moving forward.
I have a question about the kind of international standards in terms of reporting. One of the things that I keep seeing is new regulations, new opportunities to report. How does this line up with things like Carbon Disclosure Project, GRI reporting mechanism? How can we begin to tell people about this in the language of business that we've been trying to share around the world?
I don't have an easy answer for that. I'd be happy to talk with
I mean,
you.
I would love to try to put this in terms of GRI or something like that, so we can share this in other people's language.
Well, one of the things I would do to start answering that question would be to have a chat with you, but also to see how California is doing this, because as I say, BC and California are kind of alone on the low carbon aspects of this. Part of the difficulty is getting the rest of the world to understand. One of the things that is a consequence of the low carbon requirements is that if you can only reduce carbon intensity through significant use of renewable fuels, and getting to about the 2014 targets will require more than 5% renewable content in both gasoline and diesel. Why do we need a minimum volume requirement? Well, I'll tell you, one of the most important reasons to keep a minimum volume requirement is that the banks don't understand low carbon, but they do understand volume demand. And so if a biofuel producer wants to count on the Western Canadian market one of the first things that gets asked is, what is your expected demand? And the measure is, what regulations will require how many liters of what? So actually, here are some numbers. This is for the 2010 reporting year. Major suppliers, this represents 95% of the fuel in terms of renewable and 100% in terms of a non-renewable. We have an exemption for suppliers under, well, it was under 200 million for 2010. It'll be under 50 million for 2011. This province consumed 4.8 billion liters of gasoline and 3 billion liters of diesel. Of that, 6.3% of the gasoline was renewable, and 3.16%, 3.2% of the diesel was renewable. Interesting piece of information that most people are not aware of is that 1/3 of that diesel was not biodiesel. The renewable content was not biodiesel. In a forum like this, no, it was canola, palm, waste oil, all kinds of the same free fatty acids that go into biodiesel, but it was made into diesel in Finland.
Hydrogenated.
Hydrogenation-derived renewable diesel is how we defined it in the regulation. And up until this spring, there were only 2 plants in Finland in all of the world. The 2 plants in Finland were the only ones producing this fuel. It does have low carbon intensity, but it's, well, diesel's about, on the gasoline equivalent, 78 grams per megajoule. HDRD, this renewable diesel, is about 48 grams, and biodiesel is about 11. So in a regime where we value carbon intensity, rather than just saying renewable volume, which is mostly what applied for 2010, because the target for low carbon didn't exist. It was a reporting only year to get the system going. So all they had to do is deliver renewable volumes. We ended up with 1/3 of that volume met by this renewable diesel. Not for technical reasons exclusively, mostly because the original regulation was going to call for 5% diesel, biodiesel, and the industry lobbied successfully that at the last minute they were unable to get enough biodiesel in the mix, and northern BC was a huge problem. So we brought in that 3, 4, 5%. And so a number of the majors, 2 of the majors, had already committed to the volumes for renewable diesel, expecting to have to go to 5%. So they couldn't back out of these contracts. They deliver the fuel. It doesn't have, it's better diesel than petrodiesel. So it doesn't have warranty restrictions. The only problem it has is low lubricity. Does anybody know a good lubricity additive for diesel? So Lower Mainland saw probably on average at various times 10% renewable content, because why ship it to the rest of the province when you can just throw it in the tank with the rest of the diesel? And we paid a premium for it. So that's one of the reasons why we have to look at whether 5% is something we have to still hold to when the makeup fuel is coming literally halfway around the world. And the feedstock went halfway around the world to get to that plant. Thirds. Started in Malaysia, some of it, hopefully not. The better palm plantations is what they tried for, but we don't like that. But we also have the potential for HDR plant in British Columbia. And it's not cheap, so we have to keep the demand up to make sure that there's an incentive for local production.
Oh, I was just going to ask where that feedstock came from, but it all came from BC.
Well, it didn't come all from palm,
Yeah.
but this is Neste. For Finland, they were getting it from, their preference was waste oils, rapeseed from Europe, local as possible. But their plants make 120 million gallons a year each. So they had to make sure they had reliable sources, and they probably ended up, they went for sustainable palm and discovered that the sustainable palm criteria are not necessarily completely reliable. So.
What about the other 60%? Was it domestic or was it imported?
It was canola-based biodiesel. It comes out of 2 major producers in the United States, Imperium and ADM in Velva, North Dakota. And they both made a point of sourcing Canadian canola to produce it. So Canadian prairie canola went down to the States to be processed and came back up to BC. They're both near the Canadian border. It's not much of a carbon intensity penalty to have it make that trip, but they were the only two facilities in North America that could meet the petroleum company's standards for biodiesel to be blended with their feedstock.
And was that BQ 9000 or was that?
Beyond.
Okay.
The Canadian General Standards Board standard for B100 is coming out in the next few months if they can afford a translator. And there's one test in there that is new to biodiesel testing, cold soak filter blocking tendency test. And that was developed by Imperial. It was done to make sure that they had a standard to work towards, really. And it takes care of the unwanted precipitates. It was,
You said that was developed by Imperial?
well, it was developed with Imperial Oil.
Oh, Imperial Oil.
Yeah.
This is different from the cold soak filtration.
It is different from the cold soak filtration test, yeah. And it adds a level of rigor, and it does improve the quality of biodiesel. The issue is whether that quality level is necessary in your market. And this is where I'm talking about northern climates. It was an eye-opener to us, by the way, when everybody said, 5% is doable. Kumar and I have to have a discussion, but it's not going to be too difficult to sort out. But when biodiesel was promoted, it's workable at 5% in almost any climate. But in Europe, where a lot of the examples are, where they move into extreme northern zones, as they call extreme northern, they don't use biodiesel in the winter. They avoid the cloud point issues. And somebody came to us and said, here's the European zone maps for temperature, and here's the Canadian. If you look at what the temperature range is for extreme cold in Europe and normal climate, we here are in the extreme zone for Europe. Northern BC is colder than any fuel zone in Europe by 2 or 3 degrees. And if you're an oil company and you're targeting that last 2 or 3 degrees because your customers demand it, you have difficulty meeting the standard if you have to blend biodiesel in.
Mike, we've got about 10 minutes left, so
Yeah.
we can take short questions through. If you say,
I liked this cartoon when I saw it the other day too. I'm not saying we got it perfect. I'm not saying it's all going to work in the end, although I'm fairly committed to it. But anything's better than leaving it all alone. Question?
How does Canada maintain a non-B5 when ASTM B975 allows 5% biodiesel?
Canada has its own standards. And allowing 5% biodiesel doesn't mean that there is or has to be biodiesel in the mix. We don't import, at least in Western Canada, we don't import significant volumes of anything from any fuel from the United States. It's produced for this market and over to Winnipeg. It's produced in a refinery complex out of Edmonton and an independent, the Federated Co-ops in Regina, Husky in Prince George, and Chevron in Burnaby. And they only import from other markets if there's a shortage. So they control it from the ground to your gas tank. And that's a very different business model than the United States, by the way. We have a completely vertically integrated industry supplying 60% of the fuel. The other 40% comes out of the same refineries, but it moves into the hands of the more independent suppliers, the more local stations like Safeway and Save-On in town here and so on.
Yeah, there's a lot more independent jobbers in the U.S.
Way more.
But there's another practical reality that when you ship any biodiesel in any fraction, blended in any fraction across the U.S. border, you automatically incur a liability to retire the renewable, the RINs associated or what would have been the RINs associated with that kind of fuel. So in case of biodiesel, it's 1.5 RINs per gallon of biodiesel. So if I ship B5 into Canada, I can do that, but now I've just incurred a $2 liability on a gallon of fuel. And that's creating a big problem for you, I'm sure, because it puts, none of the two Canadian suppliers in Vancouver want to sell exclusively in the US. They don't want to sell a drop of product in the Vancouver market because there's a $2 incentive to export.
The other issue is because we have the massive integration, six suppliers control our fuel supply. And they are very competitive amongst themselves, right? They don't necessarily like dealing with anything that causes paperwork, strangely enough, because paperwork costs money, right? You have to have extra staff, you have to understand. Well, every small supplier is another contract to administer. One number I heard from somebody is that under the current situation, they're managing anywhere from 150 to 300 contracts a year for their supply of fuels and sales out to the bigger organizations, including their own franchisees. If they have to go to a renewable fuel supplier who can only supply a fraction of their needs, they have to have a contract for every one of those, and they have to have redundancy. So I have to have a contract with your company, and I might never buy any fuel from you. But if I have a problem, I'm going to come to you and I'm going to demand the fuel now at the price we negotiated. Do you want to do business like that? So from the oil company's point of view, it's a big nightmare because there's too many of these little guys, and you've got to do a quality inspection on all of them. You've got to stay on top, and again, you might never do business with them. They're there as a safety margin, right? If you're the small guys, there are better markets. There are easier places to pursue selling your fuel. But in BC, it's getting a little tricky right now, and I'm talking to Brian about some of those issues. Actually, can I jump to Bjorn for a second? Yeah.
Well, I have sort of somewhat of a limited sympathy for oil companies and car companies. What I don't understand is, I mean, government seems to always accommodate or trying to accommodate these big corporations. And by tradition, by history, human ingenuity is increased when there are issues to deal with.
Yeah.
So, for me, the government is there to set some standards. And heck, the precipitation issues, fuel issues, and those can be solved in mechanical ways, with preheating and so forth. There are all sorts of things that can be done. It's not, we're not just looking at one thing, but I can change a car to run on biofuel in very severe climates. It's not a big deal. And the materials for that are produced in British Columbia. So it would be an opportunity, or can be produced in British Columbia, there are right now. It can be an opportunity for big corporations to be forced to work together with small local businesses that apply things to the local climate. So why is that not happening?
Good question.
And the answer is?
I don't have one. That's one of the things. This regulation, the 10% reduction, has been called a technology forcing requirement. We don't know how people are going to comply in 2020 and deliver fuel with those lower carbon intensities. What we see is a lot of people lobbying saying, well, if you don't know, it can't be done, and it's a stupid law, get rid of it, we're not going to comply. And if you think that's a joke, the reality that I have seen is that the fuel companies say it is not an option to fail to comply. So they will not pay penalties because they will comply, or they will leave the market. One major company did show us a business plan to shut down all operation on Vancouver Island in 1 month as a way of achieving compliance. If you're the Minister of Energy, do you want to, or can you afford to let that happen?
Can you afford to have them present that business plan?
That's right.
It's confidential. Of course it is, but they would do it. Or they would begin to do it, because they did. We heard from their customers. Boy, did we hear from their customers.
Well,
So I want to take off my government jacket and have the debate, because I'm with you on it. It's frustrating. And the thing is that we wouldn't even have this, I'll go back to the beginning, we wouldn't even have this regulation if it hadn't started with individuals demanding the fuel, if it hadn't started with Brian getting his picture in the paper to lead me to ask questions to, there were other people who noticed things like that as well. And then government says, okay, there must be some grounds to this. We put a regulation in. We do have renewable fuel in this province in significant volumes. Even though we've had to accommodate oil companies, even though we've had to recognize it. I've had the national fuel engineer for Imperial say, this stuff is just shit. We don't want this. We don't know what to do with it. Why are you forcing us to do this? On the standards board. A year later, after they had put in this new test, sat down next to him at the standards board meeting in Ottawa last month. He says, this stuff's not so bad. He says, this is actually workable. We can use it for lubricity. We can add it to the fuel, and might even be cheaper eventually. The long term maybe looks like 20% renewable diesel, which is very low lubricity, and 15% biodiesel, and only a small fraction of petroleum. That was just, talk over a beer and whatever. But here was a rabid anti-anything but petroleum person who started to change his mind in a position to have his opinion listened to. So change is happening. It's just invisible so far. Do you want to shut me down?
And you and I have talked about this, and so I don't expect you to have an answer. It more kind of gets to the root of the law itself. So when we look at the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, the Renewable Fuel Standards Act, and of course the implementation tool for that is the carbon tax. And the justification for bringing these taxes in, or when it's explained to the public, is always that it's all about climate change, it's about reducing greenhouse gases. And so if that's the case, obviously life cycle carbon is essential, and you have to be able to differentiate between where the carbon is coming from. Is it coming from a fossil fuel source? Is it coming from already within the biosphere? Is it carbon neutral? And of course, the acts don't differentiate that. When you look at the renewable fuel standard, it classifies diesel as biodiesel, classifies them as the same thing.
Now hang on. The renewable fuel standard does classify because it is the carbon tax. You're talking about the motor fuel tax and the carbon tax.
Actually, that's right.
Yeah.
So tools that are used to actually to enforce those acts.
Right.
And so it's just it's kind of having your cake and eat it too. That to bring these in, they've justified it on the climate change argument, but then they're not differentiating the life cycle carbon in the tax itself. And so I know it's a big question for the people here in British Columbia. That's something that's obviously a very big political question, because you don't get laws changed very easily. But I just want to bring it to people's attention that that's in fact the case. And we're kind of working on it. And as I said, I think earlier on, it's one of the things that's been bringing the co-ops together. It's funny that it's sometimes one of those things that's that outside, perceived threat that tends to be the catalyst that brings together. But I'd like to create a discussion of that after maybe some one-on-ones if people want to see me. I know we've been working on it with the Victoria Co-op, and Michael's been very open to discussing this, and the length of the degree that he can help in this position. But
Yeah. Brian's right. The carbon tax has what looks like a glaring policy inconsistency, and it stems from a bureaucratic system that is having or an accounting system that is having difficulty recognizing the difference between what's needed under the renewable fuel regulations at 5% and what might be happening at the local level that goes well beyond that in the B100s. And the B100s got squeezed out on that one, and as Brian knows, I think we'd like to find a way of bringing back that recognition. But it does require government to reaffirm the commitment to GHG reductions and not just tax policy. Yeah.
I think a very constructive thing would be to take advantage of the carbon objectives to provide not only a benefit to carbon reduction, but also to open up the playing field with fuel supply in British Columbia.
Diversity.
You talk about that the majors control the distribution. That is by intention to reduce the competitiveness in the BC market, and it's hurting BC consumers substantially. Just across the border, there's in Seattle, for example, is served by 30 major petroleum distributors. And they're all peers, and they all compete with each other, and they can pick up fuel from, particularly diesel, they can pick up fuel from one of 5 refineries, bring in product by rail. There's so much diversity of options, and buy from, a whole bunch of different suppliers of renewable fuel too.
That's right.
And that just isn't the case in the Lower Mainland. It just isn't the case.
It's not the case anywhere in Canada. And just a note that if that is a direction to make a change, that more competition would improve pricing, the Canadian market is too small for that in terms that there are maybe 10 major suppliers in all of Canada. If Canada wants, or even if BC wants to move to more of an American model in terms of diversity in the petroleum sector, we would have to be looking at a national energy policy, because BC is not even one half of the market for the Western refinery complex. And the Western fuel is one half of the equivalent. It's 1/3 of the national fuel
I'm not certain about
consumption.
that, because when I look at places like even much smaller towns than Vancouver, like Boise,
Mhm.
there's a lot more competition, a lot more diversity.
Of course,
They're
but it
stranded.
starts at the top with the fact that the refineries don't all own the racks, and don't all own the card
But
locks
you have something,
and the gas stations.
that's an asset that you can take advantage of, and that's that there are 4 refineries in Northwest Washington.
Mhm.
And I've talked to several distributors in Canada who would be more than happy to pull product from just across the border
sure. Yeah.
and bring it to Chevron, frankly. Chevron has a complete monopoly. And so that would be a wonderful way to benefit just purely on diesel prices
Yeah.
to the lower. And then, of course, when you talk about renewable fuel, now all of a sudden the options really open up.
Agreed. Well, we already go international for our renewable fuels.
Right.
We don't have the capacity in Canada yet to produce
But
what
it has to
what
be
BC
bought by, it
demands.
still has to be bought by the.
Yeah, because
the
it's distributed by the,
Yeah.
yeah. I don't disagree, but it's like I say, in the Canadian context, it is very much a national debate that
In
has
terms
to
of volume, we
happen.
have a cutoff on renewable fuels, so small players like me cannot even, there's no incentive for me to
Yes.
go after that market.
Yes.
Because there's no way by the way, neither California or BC also have any kind of a credit trading system yet. So once that's in place, there'll be, even the smallest co-op, so co-ops are small, they produce very little fuel, but on a per gallon basis, it would be plenty of income for co-ops.
Yeah.
It would be, maybe even $1 a gallon, or in the
Yeah.
US case, $2 a gallon. I mean, that would be more than enough money to sustain, provide overhead funding for
Sure.
co-op after co-op after co-op.
Sure. Yeah. There's a lot of opportunity.
And then let them
to
sell
take next
directly.
steps.
And I would say, and then, forget the big oil distribution system. These co-ops would sell directly, and then sell the notional credits to the majors.
Mhm.
It makes the majors' job easier too.
Yeah.
We've got a job for you as a lobbyist up here, so. Come on up. We've only got time for about 2 more questions, just really quick ones, so.
Good point.
Yeah, Luke.
So thanks for coming here, Michael. I'm with the Vancouver Co-op, I think the largest biodiesel co-op. We're totally getting killed by this atrocious carbon tax.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what your...
Can I just double check? When you say carbon tax, are you also referring to motor fuel tax?
Yeah.
Because it was exempt before 2010 on motor fuel tax, which the two together add up to about 30 cents a liter for Lower Mainland.
And so we just saw our price jump up 30 cents
Yes.
a liter and we sell far less.
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous. So I'm curious what your ministry is doing to help co-ops that are super local like us, like Township.
Well, our ministry, Energy, doesn't influence tax policy because that's a different.
So that's the finance ministry, and I understand we need to lobby for them.
Yeah,
but
so
what
what,
are you doing
I know,
for
what
us?
are we doing? Nothing right now. And I'll tell you,
You spent
on the-
actually quite a bit of time with me on the phone, and I think we're coming up
True.
with a couple strategies. There's different approaches, for sure, and the political approach isn't something that Michael can take, I think. But as far as policy and looking at how that policy is applied, and we have been talking about a number of different things, and I invite you to talk to me after, Luke, and I'll fill you in on some of that. But it'd be a longer conversation than we have time for right now. But on the political side, and changing the laws, that's all. As far as taxation, that is all the Ministry of Finance.
Yeah, and just from my ministry point of view, it's frankly a matter of resources. You've met the implementation team. Jennifer's here somewhere. There's 2 of us on this entire regulation. Yes? Yeah. California has maybe 5 to 10 times more fuel. They have 7 major suppliers providing over 90% of their fuel, and another 50 or 60 of all the small folks that are reporting. We have roughly the same numbers. They have 20 to 30 staff and an annual operating budget of between $500,000 and $1 million for contract services, for academic background research, for policy papers, and all of that. We have Jennifer and myself. So that question is on my desk, which is swamped. And as Brian knows, I've been talking, we'd like to see something change, because we recognize, in my policy group, we recognize that it is groups like the co-op, like Biofleet, Canadian Biodiesel Corporation, that no longer is able to do any business in the province, and City Farm and Consolidate, they're the ones that created the environment that made this regulation possible. And now you're shut out. Yeah, as I said, legislation is a heavy-handed tool.
Okay, so if there's no more questions or comments, then thank you very much, Michael.
Thanks for listening. No, but I can give you I've got notes to go with it, but I can give you the slides.
And so if there's any grease collectors here, Dara's out there, he's doing his talk after lunch, and he'd love you to come take his survey for a quick minute. And otherwise, lunch is just across the way in the admin building, across the field. And lunch is until 1:30, or until 2:30.